Russia has lost an An-26 military transport aircraft and is also losing control over its aviation. And new interesting details about this incident are emerging. This is the opinion of military expert Alexander Musienko. Russian social media channels reported the loss.
This tiny peninsula has started wars, toppled governments, and reshaped global alliances. And today, it sits at the center of a conflict that could define the future of Europe. But here's the part most people don't understand. Crimea isn't just land, it's leverage, it's power. And once a country builds its power around a place like this, walking away stops being an option. Because once you see the full picture, one thing becomes clear. Russia was never going to give up Crimea. Not now, not later, maybe not ever. At first glance, Crimea looks almost insignificant. A narrow peninsula stretching into the Black Sea. Easy to miss, easy to underestimate. But that's exactly the illusion. Because in geopolitics, the most important places rarely look powerful. They control power. And Crimea does exactly that. It sits in a position that allows whoever controls it to influence trade routes, military movement, and regional dominance across the entire Black Sea. So while it looks small on a map, in reality, it functions like a switch. Flip it one way, Russia dominates the region. Flip it the other, and that dominance disappears. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because Russia didn't just want Crimea, it needed it. To understand why, you have to go back over 200 years, not to modern politics, but to empire. In 1783, under Catherine the Great, the Russian Empire annexed Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. At the time, it looked like another territorial gain. But in reality, it solved a problem that had limited Russia for centuries: geography. Russia's ports in the north froze during winter. Its navy was restricted, its trade slowed, its military reach was limited. For a rising empire, that's a weakness. Crimea changed that overnight, because for the first time, Russia gained consistent access to warm waters. Year-round, no interruptions, and at the center of that advantage was one place: Sevastopol. Sevastopol wasn't just a port, it was a breakthrough. A deep-water harbor that never froze. Naturally protected, perfectly positioned. It became the home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and one of the most strategically valuable military locations in the world. From here, Russia could extend its reach far beyond its borders, into the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, into global influence. And this is the moment where Crimea stops being territory and becomes capability. Because without Crimea, Russia doesn't just lose land, it loses reach. In fact, take Crimea away, and Russia is pushed back into being mostly a land power again. And that changes everything. But projection of power is only half the story. Because Crimea doesn't just let Russia move outward, it lets Russia control what comes inward. From this peninsula, it can monitor shipping lanes, influence energy corridors, and restrict access to key waterways like the Sea of Azov. That means economic pressure, strategic leverage, and silent influence without firing a single shot. So now the question shifts. If Crimea is this valuable, how did Russia ever lose control of it? This is where history takes a turn most people overlook. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made a decision that seemed minor at the time. He transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. No war, no conflict, just a political decision. And at the time, it barely mattered, because both regions were part of the Soviet Union. There were no real borders, no competing governments, no strategic consequences. It was internal, symbolic, almost irrelevant. But history has a way of turning small decisions into massive consequences. Because in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly that internal transfer became very real. Ukraine became independent, and Crimea, long tied to Russia, was now part of another country. On paper, it was legal. But geopolitics isn't just about legality, it's about perception. And from Russia's perspective, this felt like a loss. Still, for years, the situation held. Russia maintained access to Sevastopol through agreements. Ukraine retained sovereignty. Tensions existed, but they were controlled, balanced, contained, until suddenly, they weren't. 2014 changed everything. Ukraine entered political crisis. Protests erupted. the government collapsed, and a new direction began to form, one that leaned toward the West. Now pause for a second, because this is where the stakes jump. If Ukraine moved closer to NATO, then NATO could move closer to Crimea. That means Western military presence, Western naval access, Western influence, right next to Russia's most important strategic asset. From Moscow's perspective, this wasn't a distant risk. It was immediate, and it was unacceptable. So Russia didn't wait. It acted. In a rapid and calculated move, it took control of Crimea and formally annexed it. Globally, the reaction was immediate. Condemnation, sanctions, rising tensions. But inside Russia, the reaction was completely different. Celebration. Because this wasn't framed as expansion, it was framed as correction, a return, a restoration of what was always considered Russian. The phrase Krim Nash, Crimea is ours, spread across the country. And at the center of it was Vladimir Putin. He didn't just justify the move, he elevated it, describing Crimea as sacred, historically tied to Russian identity. And that message resonated deeply, because this wasn't just about strategy anymore. It became emotional, symbolic, psychological, and here's the turning point most people miss. Once territory becomes tied to identity, it stops being negotiable. But taking Crimea was only the beginning. Holding it, that was the real objective. And Russia moved fast to make its control permanent. Billions were invested into infrastructure. Military bases expanded, defense systems deployed, energy and transport networks rebuilt. Then came the most visible signal of all, the Kerch Bridge, a direct physical link between Russia and Crimea. On the surface, it's infrastructure, but strategically, it's something else. It removes dependence, it locks in control, and it sends a clear message: this isn't temporary, this is permanent. And permanence changes the equation. Because the longer control lasts, the harder it becomes to reverse. Populations shift, systems integrate, reality stabilizes. At some point, reversing control isn't just difficult, it becomes destabilizing. Now step back and look at the full picture. For Ukraine, Crimea represents sovereignty, territory, national identity. But for Russia, the stakes are different, higher, more complex. Militarily, losing Crimea means losing its most important naval base in the Black Sea. Strategically, it means opening the door for NATO to move closer than ever before. Geopolitically, it means losing influence in a region where power is constantly contested. But the deepest layer isn't military or strategic, it's political. Because when Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea, it became one of the defining moments of his leadership. It boosted his popularity, strengthened his image, reinforced a narrative of strength and control. Now imagine the opposite, giving it back. That wouldn't be seen as compromise, it would be seen as weakness, as retreat, as failure. And in a system where perception shapes power, that kind of shift isn't just risky, it's dangerous. So when you combine everything, history, geography, military strategy, political survival, national identity, you start to see why Crimea is different from any other disputed region in the world. It isn't just territory, it's a foundation, a pressure point, a symbol, a line that cannot be crossed. That's why, despite sanctions, pressure, and ongoing conflict, Russia shows no real willingness to negotiate over Crimea. Because from its perspective, there is nothing to negotiate. Giving it up wouldn't just mean losing land, it would mean losing influence, losing security, losing credibility, and perhaps most importantly, losing a piece of identity that has been built over centuries. So the next time you look at a map and see that small peninsula extending into the Black Sea, remember this: it may look insignificant, but it holds the weight of empires. It carries the echoes of history, and it sits at the center of a conflict that is far from over. Because as long as power, identity, and strategy remain tied to this land, Crimea will never just be a place, it will be a red line. And if neither side can afford to lose it, then the real question isn't who controls Crimea, it's this: how does this end?